Hello, friend, and welcome back to the Subconscious Classroom. Tonight, we drift into one of the strangest dreams humanity has ever chased: the desire to sleep, not just for a night, but forever. Across caves, cathedrals, laboratories, and deep cryogenic vaults, people have tried to escape time itself, to pause their lives like a bookmark and reappear in a better chapter. Some waited for healing, some hoped to outlive war, others simply couldn't bear to be awake anymore. This is the story of those who tried to leave the present behind, from hermits buried in silence, to scientists freezing the future, to dream cults who believed the mind could live where the body could not. Settle in. Let the noise of the day fade away. You're about to journey through a history that sleep never quite forgot. Let us begin. Part 1: Sleep that refused to end. It begins, as it so often does, in a cave. Not a symbolic one, not the cave of the mind or the metaphor of unknowing, but a literal damp-walled hole in the earth. The kind where the air stands still and the walls weep quietly. For thousands of years, people have gone into caves seeking something deeper than sleep. A pause, a stillness so profound that it might outlast time itself. Long before cryonics, long before medical sedation or even the concept of coma, there were those who looked at the ordinary sleep of night and asked, could it go on forever? Not metaphorically, literally. Could a person slumber for months, for years, for centuries? In the ancient world, sleep and death were neighbors. The Greeks imagined hypnos and thanatos, sleep and death, as twin brothers. The Romans followed suit. In China, dreams were messages from the ancestors. In India, yogic traditions spoke of slowing the breath, stilling the blood, withdrawing from the world so completely that time could pass without touching you. None of these were seen as illusions. They were studied, practiced, perfected. Some of the earliest documented sleepers weren't trying to cheat death. They were trying to meet it with preparation. Hermits in Syria during the 4th century AD would seal themselves in caves for weeks or months, eating nothing, speaking nothing, sleeping endlessly in the dark. This wasn't always seen as madness. It was holiness. If you could retreat from the world so deeply that your heartbeat no longer belonged to it, you were already halfway to another realm. Entire communities gathered around these so-called living tombs. Pilgrims would place their ears to the stone walls to hear if the hermit was still breathing. And sometimes they were, and sometimes they weren't, and it wasn't always clear which result was more miraculous. Centuries later, the same impulse appeared in the ice-locked monasteries of Russia. Here, the Skopsy sect believed that sleep was a kind of purity. They documented men who lay in bed for weeks on end, motionless, arms crossed like a corpse, waiting for the apocalypse. But the world never ended, so they kept sleeping. The belief that you could choose not to die, but also not to live, kept resurfacing across cultures. In medieval Europe, there were stories of saints who slumbered for decades, woken only by divine need. A 12th century legend from France tells of a monk who fell asleep for 100 years in the crypt of an abbey, only to wake and discover that nothing above ground remained. His waking was less a resurrection than a punishment. These stories weren't entertainment. They were warnings. But not everyone found sleep so solemn. In 17th century Germany, the Seven Sleepers of Ephesus became a popular tale in Protestant pamphlets. It told of 7 young men who hid in a cave to escape Roman persecution and fell asleep for 200 years, waking to a Christian empire. The story was recounted with glee, proof that truth outlasted tyrants. Merchants printed woodcuts of the seven, snoozing peacefully while empires rose and fell. Sleep in this version was not punishment or piety. It was survival. By the time the Enlightenment arrived, however, the tone had shifted. Science demanded test subjects, and the idea of sleep as preservation took on a new, almost clinical energy. In 1799, British physician James Curry experimented with therapeutic hypothermia. He dunked people, mostly himself, into freezing water and documented the slowed heart rates, the diminished consciousness. What he wanted was data. What he got were whispers of suspended life. His writings influenced Napoleon's battlefield doctors, who began observing that deeply cold soldiers often survived wounds that should have killed them. Not despite their sleep-like stillness, but because of it. This led to what can only be called a very strange century. In the 1800s, Victorian scientists, spiritualists, and amateur hypnotists began to take the notion of eternal sleep quite literally. They didn't want to die. They didn't want to live either, not in the ordinary sense. What they wanted was to enter a kind of pocket in time, to disappear from the moment and reappear in a better one. And so came the first sleep cults. They weren't large, they weren't loud, but they were real. One such group formed in southern France in the 1860s. They believed the world was about to undergo a violent spiritual reckoning, what they called the Great Shift, and that only those who could insulate their souls through long, undisturbed sleep would emerge sane. The members rented homes in the countryside, drew the shutters, drank herbal sedatives, and waited. Some slept for days, some for weeks. A few may have never woken at all. News spread slowly. The French authorities dismissed it as rural hysteria. But whispers made their way across the Channel to England, where eccentric aristocrats began sponsoring slumber experiments of their own. One lord, his name conveniently lost to history, commissioned a bed to be built underground, beneath his estate, surrounded by lead walls. He believed dreams could be protected from interference this way. He paid a nurse to bring food only once a week. He believed he could train his body to need fewer interruptions. The experiment reportedly lasted 2 years. When it ended, he claimed he had spoken with people from the future in his sleep. It was easy to dismiss, until people began trying to replicate it. Meanwhile, across the ocean, Americans were doing what Americans always do, turning strange ideas into marketable products. In the 1890s, several inventors filed patents for hibernation chambers. These were not cryogenic. They used herbal mists, oxygen deprivation, and in some cases, vacuum pressure. They were part sleeping pod, part coffin. The brochures promised clarity, peace, suspension, not quite death, not quite life. One ad read, "Sleep now, wake later, wake better." It was perhaps the most honest slogan the era ever produced. All of this unfolded against the backdrop of a world becoming increasingly obsessed with progress. Railroads, telegraphs, electricity. What if sleep could be part of that acceleration? What if you didn't have to live through the awkward middle parts of history? What if you could skip to the future? By the turn of the 20th century, the conversation had shifted again. No longer about faith or legend or even eccentricity. It was now about science. The Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov, better known for his dogs, studied hypnosis and prolonged unconscious states. He theorized that the brain could enter a kind of defensive suspension under stress. Not sleep, something deeper, something more final. His lab notebooks included notes about patients who had entered these protective sleeps and stayed there for months. At the same time, in Japan, interest in hibernating monks was resurfacing. Reports emerged from rural temples of ascetics who would gradually starve themselves, entering a trance state so profound that their bodies stopped decaying after death. These were not bedtime stories. The monks had records, burial chambers, rituals. It wasn't exactly sleep, but it was close. And as the 20th century marched toward its many wars, people began to ask harder questions. Not just, can we sleep forever? But should we? When the First World War broke out, soldiers began encountering catatonic shock. Men who witnessed trauma so severe they stopped responding to the world entirely. They didn't speak, didn't move. Some closed their eyes and remained that way for weeks, even months, breathing shallowly, refusing food, apparently lost in some internal realm. Medical professionals were baffled. Were they faking? Were they dreaming? Or had they actually found a way to retreat from a world too terrible to endure? It is here, in the ruins of the old world, that our story starts to feel very modern, because people began trying to control it. Sleep was no longer something that happened to you. It became something you could design. Part 2: Designing the perfect long sleep. If you could choose when to sleep, and more importantly, when to wake, wouldn't you? By the 1920s, this question no longer lived in monasteries or the margins. It had moved into laboratories and patent offices. The dream of engineered sleep became something modern people began to chase with clocks, wires, and syringes. The first serious attempt to medically induce long-term sleep came from a small group of European doctors studying barbiturates. These drugs were initially developed to treat anxiety and seizures, but their side effect, a prolonged, heavy unconsciousness, sparked fascination. In psychiatric clinics across Germany and Switzerland, physicians began putting patients into prolonged narcosis, a state of drug-induced sleep lasting anywhere from several days to over a month. The idea? To quiet madness, to let the mind, quite literally, sleep through its own illness. In Vienna, a physician named Jacob Cleese pioneered a technique he called sleep therapy. He used a cocktail of medications to keep mentally ill patients asleep for up to 20 days. He believed the brain needed a complete break. Newspapers wrote about it with awe. The doctor who cures through slumber. Hospitals from London to Buenos Aires followed suit. But what began as medicine quickly attracted the curious and the eccentric. In 1929, a Russian émigré in Paris was found in a rented apartment surrounded by medical equipment and pages of scrawled notes. He had attempted to place himself into induced sleep using a makeshift mix of sedatives and oxygen tanks. His stated goal was to wake in a calmer century. He failed, but his notes sparked interest in other circles, particularly among fringe futurists who believed humanity's salvation lay not in action, but in stillness. Across the Atlantic, America was flirting with its own version of forever sleep. Not with syringes or monastic quiet, but with refrigeration. In the late 1930s, a man named Bruno Hauptmann, better remembered for his connection to the Lindbergh baby kidnapping, allegedly spoke to reporters about a secret plan to have his body frozen and revived once he was proven innocent. While the story was likely apocryphal, it gripped the public imagination. Could cold stop time? Inventors took note. One Pennsylvania machinist began selling life extension chambers, essentially insulated boxes with built-in ice circulation. He claimed that people could enter a slowed biological phase, not entirely unconscious but removed from normal aging. Buyers were few. Skeptics were many, but seeds were planted. In the post-war boom, the dream exploded. With nuclear fear came fantasies of survival. Time capsules were buried by schools and city governments across the United States. Families were encouraged to stock fallout shelters with food, water, and sleeping pills, not just to survive an attack, but to emerge from it into something new. Advertisements promised, "Go to sleep in the old world, wake in the future." Some took it literally. By the 1950s, there were dozens of small, semi-secretive groups exploring stasis rituals. One notable community in Arizona, calling themselves the Silent Dawn Society, practiced sleep fasting. They believed that if you limited your physical and mental stimulation enough silence, enough sleep, enough absence, you could gradually stretch time itself. Members would spend entire weekends in darkened rooms, wrapped in white sheets, breathing slowly, documenting every dream. Their ultimate goal wasn't rest. It was dormancy. The public barely noticed, but science fiction did. Authors like Ray Bradbury, Arthur C. Clarke, and Ursula K. Le Guin began writing stories about suspended animation. Space travelers frozen for long journeys. Time travelers who slept through centuries. People who pressed pause on life because they simply didn't like the current chapter. The idea of sleeping to the future became a literary device and then, for some, a life goal. In 1967, the world changed. A California psychology professor named James Bedford died. But before he passed, he signed up for something extraordinary. He became the first human being to be cryopreserved. Using a hastily assembled team of scientists, morticians, and hobbyists, Bedford's body was packed in dry ice, then stored in liquid nitrogen at -196 degrees Celsius. The group behind the procedure called it cryonics, a new science that promised immortality not through living longer, but through stopping life at just the right moment. They were clear: Bedford was not dead. He was suspended. The language mattered. Cryonic enthusiasts rejected the word death. To them, it was simply a matter of timing. If your body could be kept intact, cells preserved, tissues undamaged, then future medicine could bring you back. All you needed was time, patience, and a very cold tank. The press was predictably skeptical. Headlines read like science fiction: "Man frozen to cheat death." But the movement had traction. Cryonic societies formed in New York, Michigan, and Arizona. They published newsletters, held conferences, wrote manuals. The art of dying properly, one guide read, is the art of timing your suspension. Some believed they would be awakened in decades. Others expected centuries. All of them shared one thing: faith in a future that would want them back. It's easy now to mock these hopes, easy to see them as desperate or delusional. But cryonics was never just about individuals. It was a cultural mirror. It revealed a growing sense that the present was unacceptable, that things were moving too fast or too slow or in the wrong direction entirely. It asked, what if we could wait it out? What if we could sleep through the collapse and rise again in the reconstruction? There were, of course, technical problems. Cryonics had a body count. In the 1970s, several cryonics facilities ran out of funding. The people they had suspended, carefully packed into capsules, were allowed to thaw. Some lawsuits followed. Some families were devastated. But the dream didn't die. Instead, it evolved. People began pairing cryonics with other speculative technologies: brain scanning, digital uploading, genetic preservation. Why stop at freezing the body, they asked, when you could store the soul? This spawned an entirely new discipline: mind emulation. The idea was simple if deeply hypothetical. If sleep was about preserving the brain, then why not skip the biology altogether? Why not copy the mind to a digital medium and allow it to rest there? In this vision, the forever sleeper wasn't in a bed or a tank, but in a server, dreaming in code, stored until something decided it was time to wake. In a way, this was the final expression of the dream that began in those early caves. Stillness, suspension, waiting. But digital dreaming had its own hazards. As futurists began debating the ethics of mind storage, philosophers raised questions about identity. If you sleep for 1,000 years and wake up in a changed world, are you still you? If you don't age but everything around you does, what have you really preserved? Religions responded in different ways. Some denounced cryonics as a blasphemy, an attempt to evade divine timing. Others found room for it. Buddhist thinkers pointed to the concept of rebirth through stillness. Some Christian groups debated whether death by freezing counted as real death at all. Meanwhile, everyday people kept trying quieter experiments. In 1993, a man in Oregon attempted to hibernate for 40 days in his garage, surrounded by coolers of ice and battery-powered fans. He left detailed notes. He survived, barely. His conclusions were vague but heartfelt. I saw nothing, but it felt like something. In Tokyo, a group of insomniacs formed a collective called the Velvet Pause. They gathered monthly to try new techniques in non-temporal rest, a term they coined to describe sleep not tied to natural circadian rhythms. They used isolation tanks, low-frequency sound, hypnotic suggestion. Some claimed results. Most did not, but they kept meeting. In an age of sleep deprivation, the idea of more sleep became strangely radical. By the turn of the millennium, sleeping forever was no longer fringe. It was fantasy, lifestyle, escape. People bought sensory deprivation beds, blackout chambers, dream monitoring headbands. Companies sold subscriptions to sleep tracking apps that promised to optimize your rest architecture. Influencers claimed 14 hours of sleep a night improved their productivity. Billionaires invested in longevity startups where deep rest was step one in the plan for post-human life. And still, beneath all the gadgets and jargon, the ancient question remained. What if you didn't wake up? And what if that was okay? Part 3: Catalepsy, Corpses, and Premature Burials. For a dream to last forever, the line between sleep and death must blur. And for much of human history, it did alarmingly often. Long before cryonics, centuries before brain scans or sleep trackers, people wrestled with a far stranger question. What if someone looked dead, but wasn't? What if the deepest, most unnatural sleep wasn't chosen, but accidental? Catalepsy was one such culprit. A medical condition scarcely understood for most of recorded history, catalepsy can leave a person stiff, unresponsive, and shallow breathing, sometimes for hours or even days. Eyelids don't flutter. Limbs resist movement. The pulse weakens. In the dim candlelight of a medieval sick room, the difference between a living body in cataleptic trance and a corpse was, in many cases, imperceptible. And so people were buried, alive. This terror of premature burial haunted Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries, crept into folk tales, ballads, even everyday conversation. Graveyards became scenes not just of mourning, but of fear. The living watched the dead with a kind of nervous guilt, terrified that beneath the soil someone might be stirring. Doctors began devising tests, mirrors held to nostrils, pins inserted beneath fingernails. hot irons applied to the feet, all of them imprecise, all of them occasionally wrong. By the 19th century, it wasn't just the medical community that was panicking, it was the public. Newspapers told tales of people waking in their coffins. Crypts opened decades later revealed scratch marks on the inside of casket lids. A few reports, probably embellished, spoke of the dead found with teeth shattered, hands mangled, clothing torn in a frenzy of blind panic. These images weren't just horrifying, they were familiar, because deep down people feared that sleep might not be peaceful, that it might be prison. This fear spawned an entire industry. Enter the safety coffin. Invented in dozens of variations throughout the 1800s, safety coffins were caskets outfitted with emergency escape mechanisms. Some had bells attached to strings tied to the corpse's wrist. Others featured breathing tubes, flags, even periscopes. One 1890 patent included a spring-loaded lid that could be triggered from inside with only slight movement. The most famous, and perhaps most desperate, belonged to a German priest named P.G. Pessler. His design included a window above the face, a ventilation pipe, and an internal ladder. It was less a coffin than a trapdoor waiting to be undone. Families could pay extra for a watchman to remain at the grave for several days after burial, ready to act if a bell rang or a flag rose. Cemeteries even installed waiting mortuaries, buildings where the supposedly deceased were kept above ground for a few days just in case they sat up. People weren't trying to cheat death. They were trying to make sure it had really arrived. And somewhere amid all this anxiety, the old dream of forever sleep warped. What once had been a holy pause, a spiritual stillness, now looked suspiciously like entombment. Unwilling, unchosen, a sleep no one could wake you from. The cultural effect was enormous. Writers and artists latched on. Edgar Allan Poe's short stories are littered with living burials, fevered hallucinations, and sleep mistaken for death. In The Premature Burial, 1844, the narrator confesses an obsessive fear of being buried alive and even recounts supposed newspaper clippings and first-hand accounts. It wasn't pure fiction. It was horror rooted in truth. Victorians, always attuned to spectacle, took it further. Mourning rituals became elaborate. Coffins were displayed in parlors. People posed with their dead relatives for photographs. Propped upright, eyes painted on the lids. Sleep and death became theatrically interchangeable. Some corpses were posed in bed, as if napping, to comfort those left behind. And this odd theatricality fed right back into the myth of long sleep. Because if people could be mistaken for dead, maybe they weren't dead at all. Some theorists of the time, mostly pseudoscientific fringe thinkers, began exploring the idea that catalepsy and similar states were natural gateways to suspension. That the human body had the latent ability to enter hibernation like bears or reptiles. That the right kind of trauma, environment, or training could induce a sleep that would preserve life indefinitely. They studied fakirs in India who reportedly buried themselves alive and emerged days later unharmed. They analyzed yogic breathing techniques. They fixated on legends of people who fell into deep sleep and woke years later unchanged. None of this was particularly scientific, but it was seductive because it promised a way out, not just from death, but from everything. By the late 1800s, accounts of so-called sleeping beauties began popping up in newspapers around the world. These were typically young women who had allegedly fallen into mysterious sleeps, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades. They did not age. They did not decay. They breathed faintly. They were visited by thousands. One of the most famous was Ellen Sadler of England. At age 11, in 1871, Ellen reportedly fell into a deep sleep from which she could not be roused. Doctors came from all over. Her family claimed she remained unconscious for 9 years. Some suspected fraud. Others believed a miracle. Whether real or manufactured, her story spread like wildfire. These stories weren't just oddities. They became part of the cultural lexicon. Sleeping became a form of protest, a badge of otherness, a spectacle. In some ways, they became stand-ins for the sleeping saints and monks of earlier centuries, but updated for an industrial, skeptical age. And with each new account, the public interest in long sleep deepened. The deeper issue wasn't whether these sleepers were real. It was that people wanted them to be. They wanted to believe that someone could duck out of life for a while, curl up, breathe shallowly, and wait out the horror and noise. That someone could sleep not out of despair, but of purpose. By the 20th century, this hope had blended with medicine again. The discovery of general anesthesia in the mid-1800s had already revolutionized surgery, but doctors now began studying the possibility of therapeutic coma, putting the body into a state of full suspended function to promote healing. By the 1930s, insulin coma therapy was used for psychiatric patients. Dangerous, controversial, and now discredited, it nevertheless introduced the idea that deep unconsciousness might be curative. Hospitals in the US and Europe housed patients for months in a sleep-like state, hoping to reset their mental condition. In some cases, it worked. In others, it did not. But the connection had been made. Sleep as medicine, sleep as escape, sleep as a bridge between eras, between pain and peace. And all the while, the fear of being buried alive quietly faded, not because it became impossible, but because death itself began to seem more optional, a glitch to be patched, a delay to be overcome. The 20th century would soon bring something else. A wave of people who wanted to sleep not because they were ill or holy or mistaken for dead, but because they had plans. Plans for a world they might one day wake into. Part 4, Dream Cults and the Timeless Mind. If the body sleeps, does the mind follow? Or can the brain, floating in its slow rhythms, travel somewhere time doesn't reach? As the 20th century surged forward, with its atom bombs, its space races, its blinking televisions and buzzing fluorescent lights, some people began to ask not how long they could sleep, but what they might do while sleeping. Enter the dream cults. Not formal cults exactly, not the kind with robes and sermons, but small circles of people, sometimes religious, sometimes mystical, sometimes just odd, who believed dreams were not illusions but excursions. That sleep was not a passive pause, but an active journey. That the mind, unshackled by the body's clocks and routines, could move through something bigger. They weren't entirely new. Dream interpretation had been a cornerstone of ancient cultures from Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica. Shamans, prophets, and mystics had long claimed access to other worlds through dreams. But the dream cults of the 20th century had a modern ambition: to stay in that space, indefinitely. In California in the 1950s, amid the same cultural compost that birthed spiritual communes and free love, a loose network calling themselves the Sleepers of the Radiant Eye emerged. They practiced lucid dreaming, sensory deprivation, and controlled sleep cycles designed to stretch their time inside the dreamscape. Their goal wasn't just exploration, it was migration. They believed consciousness could move into dream and stay there permanently. Every month, members gathered in silence, They took mild sedatives, lay in candlelit rooms, and entered extended sleep sessions. Sometimes these lasted 24 hours, sometimes 3 days. They shared their dream narratives afterward, cryptic, surreal, filled with the language of hidden doors and translucent cities. One woman claimed she slept through a century and woke to a better self. It wasn't science, but it wasn't nonsense either. Psychologists took note. By the 1960s, sleep labs were multiplying across Europe and America. Researchers wired volunteers with electrodes and watched their brains dance through REM stages. They studied dream content, eye movements, memory patterns, and the more they studied, the weirder things got. People who were woken during dreams sometimes reported having lived weeks or months inside a single sleep cycle. Others described memories that didn't seem to be theirs. One man reported aging 50 years in a single 8-hour dream. It was disorienting, but it hinted at something powerful. That time inside sleep was malleable. And if time could stretch inside a dream, what else could? Artists and musicians were captivated. Salvador Dali reportedly used a technique he called slumber with a key, where he'd fall asleep holding a metal object and wake the instant it dropped, catching images from the threshold between sleep and wakefulness. Writers like Jorge Luis Borges and William Burroughs spoke of dreams as tools, dimensional tools for reorganizing thought and identity. And some people predictably took it further. In 1977, a group of dream researchers in Germany founded Das Schlafhaus, or the Sleep House. It wasn't a clinic. It was a house, windowless, temperature-controlled, and lined with soundproof sleep chambers. Participants signed up for multi-week stays. Their diets were restricted. Their sleep was monitored. They were encouraged to stay unconscious as long as possible and write down their dreams in exhaustive detail upon waking. The goal? To create a kind of dream language, a grammar for sleep, a map. They never finished the map, but they claimed to find patterns, recurring locations, shared figures, even overlapping dream structures between participants who never spoke to each other. Whether coincidence, suggestion, or something stranger, they believed they were onto something ancient. A shared sleep architecture. As one paper put it, a collective unconscious made literal. And in this strange world, the notion of sleeping forever became less about biology and more about access. If a person could be guided into permanent sleep, not by freezing the body or halting time, but by simply extending the dream, would it matter whether the body ever woke? The language began to change again. No longer just suspension or hibernation, but transference, migration, dream permanence. In the early 1990s, a Japanese company quietly launched the YUM pilot program. Ostensibly a sleep optimization platform, it secretly recruited volunteers to undergo experimental deep dream conditioning. Participants stayed in a facility for 30 days, monitored around the clock, fed dream-enhancing supplements, and exposed to subliminal sound patterns while they slept. The company hoped to extend lucid dreaming into a continuous, narratively stable environment. Results were mixed. Some participants reported weeks of continuous dream memory, entire stories, places, relationships carried forward from one night to the next. Others woke disoriented, unable to distinguish dream from waking life. A few had to be institutionalized. The program was quietly ended, but it wasn't forgotten. In its wake, a global network of dream enthusiasts emerged, fueled by the internet, connected by forums, chat rooms, early podcasts. They swapped techniques, traded experiences, and built digital temples to the idea that sleep was not a break, but a portal. One group, calling themselves the Timeless Mind, published a manifesto. It read, in part, "To sleep forever is not to escape life, but to outgrow it, to step sideways, to seed a new civilization, not of cities, but of dreams." It sounds theatrical now, but at the time, it captured something real. A growing sense that the outside world, cluttered with noise, violence, and confusion, was no longer the best place for the mind to live. If sleep could give us something better, why not stay there? The idea found unlikely allies in the field of artificial intelligence. Sleep, after all, wasn't just for humans. In the 2000s, engineers began using neural networks to mimic the way the brain consolidates memories during sleep. These artificial systems dreamed, running simulations while inactive to improve performance. Some AI models even hallucinated images or sounds, building up a synthetic dream world of their own. It didn't take long before someone asked, "What if we joined them?" The idea was radical but increasingly plausible. A human mind, digitized and inserted into an AI dream cycle, might live indefinitely in a feedback loop of perfect, tailored sleep. Eternal comfort, eternal stimulus, no pain, no aging, no time. It wasn't cryonics, it wasn't sedation, it was something in between. An infinite artificial lucid dream. Sleep as habitat. Of course, ethics followed swiftly. Philosophers worried about identity fragmentation. Engineers warned of data decay, of neural model instability. Could a mind, stretched across 1,000 years of dreaming, still be considered a person? Religious thinkers weighed in again. Some compared it to purgatory. Others saw it as a secular heaven. A few saw hell. But the movement kept growing. Modern startups now offer what they call cognitive rest environments, simulated dreamscapes hosted on servers, tailored to your memories and preferences, where users can immerse themselves during long-term medical coma or cryogenic suspension. The experience is partial, primitive, but the promise is simple. You'll feel like you never left, and for some, that's enough. The ambition to sleep forever has always been two things at once: a longing for peace and a leap towards something unknown. Whether in a tomb, a cave, a nitrogen tank, or a VR headset, the instinct is the same. Maybe you've felt it too, that wish to step away, to lay down the weight of the present, to enter a soft, suspended elsewhere where nothing hurts and time is kind. Maybe it's not about escape. Maybe it's about trust. Trust that the world will still be here when you wake. And if it isn't, that maybe you won't mind. Part 5, the science of suspended animation. The dreamers imagined it. The mystics practiced it. But eventually, someone had to try to build it. Suspended animation. Not a metaphor this time, not a legend, but a hard scientific goal. To slow the body's processes so dramatically that time, for all practical purposes, stops. And unlike myth or metaphor, this attempt involved syringes, scalpels, centrifuges, cooling chambers, and the precise science of death postponed. The modern pursuit of suspended animation took root in the 20th century's obsession with managing the body like a machine. After 2 world wars left millions of people mutilated, stunned, or frozen in trauma, medicine found itself confronting hard biological questions. What exactly happens at the moment of death? Can it be reversed? Can it be delayed? And most importantly, can the threshold between life and death be made optional? In the 1960s, NASA became one of the first institutions to seriously explore suspended animation, not for science fiction, but for long-haul spaceflight. If it took decades to reach another planet, who would want to age along the way? Who would want to stay conscious, eating and breathing and wasting precious resources? The solution seemed obvious: sleep through it. NASA funded studies into deep hypothermia, cooling animals to just above freezing to slow cellular decay. Researchers observed that when the temperature dropped, oxygen use fell, metabolism slowed, and brain activity all but ceased. A chilled body wasn't dead. It was paused. The early results were stunning. Pigs and dogs cooled to near freezing could sometimes be revived hours later, especially if oxygenated blood was circulated artificially. The term therapeutic hypothermia entered medical dictionaries. Field surgeons began experimenting with it to preserve trauma victims on the brink of death. By the early 2000s, emergency rooms in the US and UK were trialing a radical procedure: replacing a patient's blood with an ice-cold saline solution to buy time for surgery. In effect, patients were put into a state of clinical death, no heartbeat, no brain function, for up to an hour. Afterward, warm blood was reintroduced, and many were revived. It wasn't science fiction anymore. It was battlefield triage. But the implications went far beyond trauma care. Could this technique be extended? Could it become a means of elective stasis? Some researchers believed so. They coined new terms: induced torpor, extended biostasis, metabolic arrest. But these weren't elegant dreams of sleeping monks or cryogenic nights. They were protocols, charts, dosage tables, brain scans. One proposed protocol, unpublished but leaked in academic circles, outlined a system in which astronauts on a Mars mission would enter induced torpor for 2-week intervals, waking briefly to perform duties, then returning to sleep. The benefits were immense: fewer supplies, fewer psychological stresses, less radiation exposure, fewer arguments. One researcher joked. Private biotech firms took notice. In the 2010s, a handful began offering preservation plans for the ultra-wealthy. While not full suspended animation, they promised medically supervised hypothermic sleep to extend life through medical emergencies. One luxury clinic in Switzerland referred to it as a wellness coma. The name didn't catch on. Meanwhile, more rigorous scientists pointed to the animal kingdom for inspiration. Bears, frogs, and certain Arctic ground squirrels could enter true torpor for months, slowing their heart rates to a few beats per minute, their breathing to a bare whisper. In some frogs, the blood actually froze solid, yet they revived in spring. If nature could do it, why couldn't we? Geneticists began studying the molecular triggers behind animal hibernation. Some hoped to find a switch, a single gene or protein that, when activated in humans, could coax our bodies into similar states. Several candidate compounds were identified. Trials on mice began. Some researchers speculated that with enough research, humans might one day be able to hibernate for weeks or even years without damaging the brain. It wasn't just space travel anymore. It was medicine. It was aging. It was waiting. One futurist called it the emergency brake for mortality, a way to stop the train of death, at least for a little while the future caught up. And yet, for every advance, there were limits. Human brains don't like being cold. Even short periods of oxygen deprivation can cause irreversible damage. The chemistry of our cells resists long-term stasis. Our organs decay even when dormant, and our memories, our precious identities, fade quickly when deprived of constant input. Suspended animation remained a fragile promise. But that didn't stop people from hoping. Cryonics organizations quietly continued their work, refining the chemicals used to prevent ice crystal formation during freezing. These vitrification agents worked more like antifreeze, turning the body into a kind of glass, molecularly stable but biologically inert. As of today, more than 300 people have been cryopreserved around the world. Thousands more have signed up. Most are in the United States, stored in sealed tanks of liquid nitrogen, heads sometimes separated from bodies to save cost, each with a file, a backstory, a hope. They are not legally dead, at least not in the eyes of their keepers. They are waiting. Even governments have quietly acknowledged the possibility. Some countries now issue death certificates that specify time of legal death versus time of cryonic suspension. The implication is clear. Someone, somewhere, believes these people may return. But return to what? That's the awkward question no lab can answer. If someone is revived 200 years from now, will they recognize the world, the language, the customs? Will they understand the laws, the currency, the etiquette of touch? Will they be welcomed or feared? Or worse, ignored? Suspended animation doesn't solve the problem of time. It only skips it. And time, as it turns out, keeps the receipts. Even in the medical field, there's growing tension. Some ethicists warn that deep stasis may only be accessible to the rich. Others worry that people will begin demanding it not as a medical necessity, but as a right. Already, court cases have surfaced in which terminal patients sought the legal right to be put into suspended animation before actual death. Judges have hesitated. Legislators, unprepared for the question, have punted. Because what's at stake isn't just sleep. It's the definition of life itself. If you can pause a person, shelve them like a book, and wake them a century later with memories intact, is that still the same person? Or have they become something new? Somewhere between corpse and child, dreamer and ghost? For now, the science remains on the edge. The tests continue. The body's cool. And still, the deeper truth persists. Suspended animation, whether achieved by prayer, poison, or protocol, is never just about prolonging life. It's about missing the parts you can't bear to live through. It's about waiting for a version of the world that finally makes sense. It's about the possibility, however remote, that tomorrow might be kinder than today. And if it takes 100 years of sleep to reach that tomorrow, well, some people are already tucked in. Part 6, the economics of eternal rest. For something so still, eternal sleep doesn't come cheap. The fantasy of sleeping forever, whether in a temple, a cryogenic tank, or a dream simulator, has always flirted with class. Who gets to vanish from the burdens of the world? Who can afford to wait it out? Who gets to lay down their life like a well-timed investment? The answer, more often than not, is the rich. In ancient Egypt, eternal rest was literally a matter of wealth. Only the elite could afford embalming, tombs, and elaborate funerary rites meant to preserve the body for eternity. Sarcophagi weren't built for convenience. They were contracts. The materials used, gold leaf, lapis lazuli, linen soaked in resin, were expensive. And the logic was brutally clear. The better preserved your body, the better your odds of waking into the afterlife intact. Fast forward several millennia and the economics remain the same, only colder. Today, a basic cryonic suspension costs between $30,000 and $200,000, depending on whether you want to preserve your whole body or just your brain. Most companies require payment up front, with funds placed in long-term trusts to cover maintenance costs. For perspective, that's more than the average American makes in a year, but not impossible for the well-prepared. Life insurance policies are often redirected toward cryonics, essentially treating eternal sleep like a form of high-end burial. And like all luxury services, it comes with tiers. Some facilities offer premium options, isolated storage chambers to prevent cross-contamination, personalized reanimation plans, post-thaw reintegration counseling. One organization offered to store your pet alongside you. Another promised neuroresilience tracking in the lead-up to death to better time the freezing. Sleep, once a birthright, had become a boutique experience. Meanwhile, the dream of affordable stasis remained just that, a dream. Mass-market suspended animation would require enormous infrastructure, legal reform, and cultural buy-in. Who would be responsible for managing thousands of sleeping citizens? Who would pay to maintain the power, the facilities, the record-keeping? What if society collapsed in the meantime? Governments, unsurprisingly, have stayed cautious. No major health system publicly funds suspended animation. No insurance policy covers elective cryopreservation. But the private sector, always ready to profit from immortality, has filled the vacuum. Sleep tech has become a billion-dollar industry. Not cryonics necessarily, but its cousin, sleep optimization. Walk through any airport or shopping mall, and you'll find aisles of products promising deep rest, neural alignment, and recovery sleep. Smart beds adjust to your temperature. Sleep masks emit low-frequency pulses to guide brainwaves. Subscription apps sell dream curation and ambient soundscapes fine-tuned to your cognitive frequency. It's not the sleep of centuries, but it's sold with the same pitch. Rest better, live longer, become more than what you are. Even in death, the economics persist. The funeral industry, especially in the West, has long capitalized on the idea that rest can be beautified. Mahogany caskets, memory foam linings, eternal memory holographic headstones. Some funeral homes now offer digital legacy services that simulate your voice, style, and preferences, just in case someone wants to talk to you while you're away. A few go further. One facility in South Korea offers living funerals, a staged death experience in which participants lie in caskets, write final letters, and contemplate their own mortality. The sessions end in quiet meditation. Participants report a strange lightness afterward, as if they've briefly tasted the long sleep and returned. The illusion of control is powerful and expensive. For the ultra-wealthy, eternal rest now includes post-death brand management, holograms, AI recreations, virtual avatars that persist in the digital world. Your consciousness, if not your body, can keep attending board meetings, issuing tweets, appearing in holiday photos. The sleep is synthetic, but so is the self. Which raises a difficult question. Is this really about sleep at all? Or is it about legacy? Maybe those who seek to sleep forever aren't trying to escape the world. Maybe they're trying to guarantee they're still in it, years, centuries, or eons from now. Even the ancient traditions understood this. In 14th century Tibet, certain monks practiced tukdom, a meditative death in which the body does not decay for days after clinical death. Disciples observed the body closely, waiting for signs of returning consciousness. In some cases, the body remained warm and flexible long after vital signs had ceased. This wasn't superstition. It was ritual, a way of controlling the story. Because when you can't control whether you wake, maybe you can control what people believe about your sleep. Modern people do the same, though less poetically. Cryonics patients often leave letters. Some record video messages to be played upon revival. Others designate future legal counsel or even schedule press releases. It's less about surviving and more about staging the comeback. And of course, there's the investment angle. Some tech moguls have publicly stated their desire to sleep through the boring middle parts of history, then wake when the singularity arrives, when artificial intelligence can cure death, clean the planet, and build them a better civilization to inherit. In this view, suspended animation isn't rest. It's a leapfrog, an economic bet placed on a better century. The irony is cruel. Sleeping forever is often sold as spiritual, personal, liberating. But in practice, it's deeply material. It requires capital, contracts, maintenance fees, legal frameworks. And as with all things material, it creates exclusion. The poor die. The rich sleep. Some critics argue that the dream of long-term sleep has always been a fantasy of the privileged, a way to avoid not just death, but responsibility, to skip the bad chapters, to disappear during collapse and reappear during the recovery, refreshed and ready for power. But others push back. They say sleep is a right, that everyone, regardless of wealth, should have the chance to pause their suffering, to defer their pain, to bet on a future they may not be ready for just yet. It's a compelling argument. But as it stands, the price of that ticket is high. And while the market churns, while the cooling tanks hum, while the servers simulate dream worlds behind locked corporate doors, millions of others are simply tired, not of death, but of living without pause. They dream of silence, not stasis, of rest that doesn't require contracts, of a sleep that doesn't cost 6 figures or demand a will or a lawyer or a lab. Just one night, just one pause, just one breath that doesn't lead to anything else. And maybe in that humble wish lies the most radical dream of all. Part 7, when you finally wake up. And what happens, truly, when you finally wake up? It's the part of the story we rarely tell. The dream is easy to imagine. The long sleep, the suspension, the cool silence where nothing can hurt you. That part is comforting. But waking is chaos. In every myth, the sleeper who returns does not return to the world they left. Rip Van Winkle wakes to find his country changed. The 7 sleepers of Ephesus stumble into a future where their faith has become law. Even in modern science fiction, the cryopreserved astronaut wakes to find the Earth unrecognizable, their family gone, their home obsolete. Waking is not peace. Waking is dislocation. It's not just a biological problem, though there are plenty of those. Muscle atrophy, neural confusion, psychological shock. Even after short-term comas, patients often struggle to reintegrate. Their sense of time collapses. Their identities blur. Loved ones feel like strangers. The mind wakes slower than the body. And that's just after weeks. What about decades? What happens when language has shifted? When culture has rerouted itself? When the songs you knew are forgotten, the rituals outdated, the world digitized in ways you can't comprehend? Waking becomes a kind of death, not of the body, but of the version of yourself that once felt grounded. And yet, people still seek it, because even if waking is painful, it means you made it. In 2004, scientists revived microscopic animals known as tardigrades that had been frozen for over a century. They twitched, stretched, and continued living as though nothing had happened. In 2020, a Siberian worm was reanimated after being frozen in permafrost for over 30,000 years. Life, it seemed, could hold its breath for longer than anyone imagined. And so we extrapolate. If a worm can wake after 30 millennia, why not us? In practice, the closest we've come is far more fragile. In Japan, a man was successfully revived after being trapped in ice for over 20 minutes with no detectable heartbeat. In Germany, a woman was brought back after hours of hypothermia-induced cardiac arrest. These are not fairy tales. These are clinical miracles, and every one of them brings us a little closer to the line between sleep, death, and whatever lies in between. But there's another problem. What if no one wants you to wake up? Imagine a sleeper preserved in a facility, funds dwindling, legal guardians long dead, stored in a capsule no one remembers. Or a virtual consciousness stuck in a digital dream that's been bought, sold, reprogrammed, buried in a server farm. Who decides when or if you return? And would you even be you? Memory is fragile. Stored thoughts, even when faithfully preserved, degrade. Experiences fade without reinforcement. People change through life because of what happens to them. If nothing happens to you for 300 years, are you still a person, or are you a fossil? In ancient times, the dead were buried with coins to pay for the journey home. But today's sleepers are buried with contracts, hopes, passwords, and a prayer that someone in the future still remembers what to do with them. Perhaps that's the most haunting part of all. The idea that sleep might last so long, that waking becomes a myth. There are tombs in Cappadocia that have not been opened in 2,000 years. Stone sarcophagi in Alexandria still sealed. Time capsules buried in American schoolyards in the 1950s, contents now forgotten. Entire spacecraft drift between stars with recordings of our voices, our music, our laughter, waiting for someone, somewhere, to press play. They are sleepers too. So are we. Because in the end, the dream of eternal sleep is not really about comfort. It's about control. Control over time, over death, over memory. A way to pause what feels unbearable and wake only when the world is once again kind. We invent pods and pills and philosophies because we want to believe that rest can fix what consciousness cannot. That peace is something you can schedule. But sleep is not a tool. It is a mystery. Even the deepest, most advanced simulations, the dream loops, the neural nets, the sensory cocoons, cannot simulate the simple trust that real sleep requires. The trust that the world will still be here, that the people you love will still be waiting, that you, in some form, will return whole. The ancient monks slept facing east, toward the dawn. The medieval dreamers wrote journals to explain themselves to a world they'd never see. Today's cryonic sleepers leave passwords and Bitcoin wallets. But none of them can guarantee what comes next. Because when you try to sleep forever, you are not just escaping time. You are trusting a stranger to build your morning. And maybe that's the most human part of all. Not the science, not the chambers, not the legal paperwork or the brain scans, but the hope that sleep, however long, ends in light, that someone still remembers your name, that after all the silence, after all the breathless waiting, there will still be a world worth waking into. Even if it's different, even if you're different, even if it hurts, you'll open your eyes and begin again.